The full story of how this woman,
I am Queen Jezebel.
She has killed them all!
Before Israel fell into darkness, before a king lost his soul, there was a woman whose
name is Jezebel, became this woman. In the bustling coastal city of Sidon, a place of sun-baked stone streets, glimmering palaces, and the ceaseless call of the sea, Jezebel was born a princess. Her father, King Ahab, ruled with the careful blend of cunning politics and ruthless devotion to the gods of their land. From the very beginning, Jezebel's life was far from ordinary. She was wrapped in silks, surrounded by treasures, and trained to understand the power that wealth and lineage could command. But her home was not one of gentle lullabies and lull of lullabies. It was a palace steeped in the scent of incense and the hum of forbidden rituals. From the first day she could walk, Jezebel's eyes were drawn not to the toys or trinkets her attendants offered, but to the temples and altars where the priests of Baal and Asherah performed their sacred dances. The air always shimmered with golden incense smoke, curling around the carved idols of gods with fiery eyes and upraised arms. Torches flickered against walls adorned with paintings of sacrifice, storms, and conquest, and the chants of the priests filled the halls with hypnotic rhythm. To the young princess it was both terrifying and mesmerizing. She would hide in shadowed corridors, clutching her small hands together, and watch as men and women in flowing robes moved in wild ecstasy, their voices rising in unison to call upon powers she could not yet understand. The dance was a blend of celebration and fear, a worship of life and death intertwined. She saw offerings laid on stone altars, the flash of knives in sunlight, the trembling of devotees as they awaited signs from the gods. And even as a child, she felt a curious thrill, a recognition that power, real and intoxicating, pulsed through these rituals. Her father noticed early that Jezebel was unlike other girls. While other children played with dolls or ran barefoot through palace gardens, Jezebel asked questions that startled even seasoned priests. Why do the people obey the gods only when afraid? If a god is powerful, why must they be bribed with blood? Ahab, instead of scolding, smiled. He saw in her a mind sharpened for politics, strategy, and cunning, a mind that could one day extend Sidon's influence beyond the seas and into foreign lands. Evenings in the palace were alive with ritual. Jezebel would sit perched on her father's lap, draped in silks and jewels, and watch as priests performed secret rites in hidden chambers. The air was thick with the mingling smells of burning resin, roasted offerings, and the salt of the sea, and sometimes in the flickering torchlight, Jezebel could see shadows on the walls dancing like spirits, a world suspended between reality and the supernatural. By the time she was a young girl, she knew that the world bowed to power, not kindness, and that the gods were not gentle protectors, but instruments to bend people to one's will. She learned early the magnetism of beauty, the cruelty of fear, and the intoxicating allure of command. And deep in her heart she carried the first sparks of ambition, the knowledge that one day she would not simply be a princess, she would be a queen who shaped the destiny of a nation. From a very young age, Jezebel displayed a mind far sharper than anyone expected from a child, let alone a princess pampered with luxury. While other girls her age giggled and played with beaded dolls, Jezebel preferred to sit quietly beside her father's advisors, absorbing every whispered conversation like a sponge soaking up water. She listened with intense, unblinking eyes that already held the fire of someone who wanted more than comfort, someone who wanted power. The servants noticed it first. When a toy was taken from her, Jezebel did not cry, she negotiated. If negotiation failed, she manipulated. and if manipulation failed, she commanded. Even as a child, her stubbornness was legendary. If she decided she wanted something, a jeweled anklet, a new tutor, a specific seat beside her father, nothing could move her. Not reason, not punishment, not fear. But what startled everyone most was her charisma. Even before she understood the weight of words, she wielded them like tools. Servants found themselves agreeing to her demands without knowing how. Visiting nobles were struck by her poise. Priests paused mid-ritual when young Jezebel stepped forward, her presence almost unsettling. It was as if she was born knowing that the world existed to be shaped by her will. King Ahab, ruthless and calculating, saw in Jezebel the very reflection of himself, only sharper, fiercer, more fearless. And so, instead of sheltering her, he began to shape her mind with purpose. Night after night, he invited her to sit beside him as he reviewed scrolls, resolved disputes, or sent orders to his officers. He taught her how politics moved like tides, how alliances were crafted, how enemies were dismantled, how fear made even the strongest bow. Power, he told her, is not taken. It is given by those too afraid to resist you. Jezebel nodded as if she already understood. He taught her how to read people's faces, how to twist their desires into obedience. He showed her how a smile could deceive, how silence could intimidate, how mercy shown at the right moment could be more frightening than cruelty. She absorbed every lesson, every tactic, every secret technique of rulership like a child drinking honey. But hers was not a passive ambition. It burned. Each night she went to bed with new hunger in her eyes, dreaming not of marriage or beauty, but of thrones, crowns, and nations trembling before her. When Jezebel was around 9 years old, her mother gave birth to another child. The palace was filled with midwives rushing about, incense burning, priests chanting blessings to Baal. Among them was an old midwife, frail, with eyes clouded like the sea in winter. She had served the royal house for decades, delivering princes and princesses with hands that trembled but never failed. Jezebel, curious as always, slipped into the birthing chamber to watch. The old woman noticed her immediately. Her tired eyes widened, not in fear, not in annoyance, but in a strange, eerie recognition. She beckoned Jezebel closer with a crooked finger. Jezebel stepped forward without hesitation. The old midwife's voice dropped to a whisper, low and trembling, the kind of whisper that seemed to echo from somewhere deeper than her lungs. Child of Ethbal, eyes like storm fire. Hear me. Jezebel's spine tingled. The room went silent, as if even the candles leaned in. You will rule a land not your own. The old woman's eyes darkened, pupils swelling like ink. But the land will vomit you out. The wind rattled the bronze window frames. A pot cracked on the floor without being touched. For a moment, Jezebel simply stared, her young face expressionless. Then, slowly, so slowly, a small, chilling smile curled at the corner of her lips. Not a child's smile. Not a smile of innocence. A smile of someone who heard a prophecy of destruction and took it as a challenge. A smile that whispered, "Let the land try." The old midwife's hands shook. She bowed her head, whispering, "May the gods have mercy." Jezebel only turned away, the gold bands on her ankles jingling softly. That dark smile, the first of many, was a warning. A warning that Jezebel would grow into a woman who would stop at nothing, cross borders, topple traditions, and bend kings to her will. A woman destined to rule, and destined to fall in a way so violent and unforgettable that history would carry her name like a curse. The news of a diplomatic journey had spread through Sidon. For weeks Israel's king, Ahab son of Omri, was crossing the borders to secure a crucial alliance with the Phoenician Empire. Sidon prepared itself with all the glittering spectacle expected for the arrival of a foreign king. Banners of purple dye hung from palace columns. Incense burned in thick spirals, and royal guards lined the marble steps like statues forged from bronze. But in the highest chamber of the palace, someone else was preparing, someone who needed no ceremony to command attention. Princess Jezebel. She stood before her polished bronze mirror as attendants fastened gold cuffs onto her wrists and draped a crimson shawl over her shoulders. Her beauty was undeniable, sharp, radiant, arresting, but it was not her face alone that held power. It was the fire in her eyes, the way she walked as if the world owed her obedience. Her father, King Ahab, entered the chamber, his steps heavy with purpose. "Today," he said, "you will meet a man who rules a land desperate for strength and influence. Israel cannot rival Sidon's wealth or power, but it can be useful." Jezebel smiled faintly. She had heard of Ahab, a king torn between his people's traditions and his own desire to strengthen his kingdom. A man who wanted greatness but lacked the iron will to seize it. In other words, someone she could shape. When Ahab stepped into the Sidonian throne room, his breath caught. There she stood beside her father, Jezebel, glowing like a flame among shadows. Her gown shimmered with threads of gold. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders like dark silk. Her chin lifted in quiet authority. Her eyes, unreadable, piercing, almost unsettling in their confidence. For a moment Ahab forgot protocol, forgot his entourage, forgot the diplomatic speech he had prepared. All he could do was stare. Jezebel noticed. Of course she did. She offered the faintest, controlled smile, a smile that did not show innocence, but strategy, curiosity, and a hint of challenge. Ahab bowed, his voice struggling for steadiness. "Princess Jezebel, your beauty is beyond description." "Beauty," she replied softly, "is fleeting. Influence is not." Ahab blinked, struck by her boldness, her intelligence, her voice as smooth as polished stone. In that instant he was captivated not just by her appearance, but by her fire, the power in her words, the unshakable certainty with which she carried herself. He had met many noble women, but none like her. None who carried both grace and danger with such effortless harmony. Talks of alliance began swiftly. Ahab offered land access, trade routes, military support, and the prestige of marrying a Phoenician princess. In return, Israel would strengthen Sidon's influence and open its borders to Phoenician commerce. But hidden beneath the polished agreements was a far more significant exchange. Ahab hungry for alliance and power. Jezebel hungry for a throne. Their marriage was sealed not with softness, but with strategy. Ahab gained Sidon's backing. Jezebel gained a foreign kingdom to mold. But beyond politics, something deeper formed between them, a dangerous fascination. Ahab admired her brilliance, her fearlessness, her confidence that outshone even kings. Jezebel saw in Ahab a man who could give her what Sidon could not, a nation willing to bow to her gods. This union was not merely a marriage, it was a collision of two spiritual worlds. Israel worshipped the God of Abraham. Sidon worshipped Baal and Asherah. But Jezebel had already decided that once she crossed into Israel, it would be her gods who reigned. Ahab thought he was marrying a beautiful queen. What he did not realize was that he was bringing into Israel a force that would shake the kingdom to its core, a storm disguised in gold and silk. And Jezebel, she walked into the marriage smiling, for she knew that her influence was only beginning. The sun hung low over the hills of Samaria as the caravan approached, its wheels grinding against dusty earth. Townspeople gathered along the roadside, squinting at the shimmering procession of Sidonian horses, jewel-studded carriages, and guards draped in crimson armor. Israel had seen visiting nobles before, but nothing like this. The air shifted when Jezebel stepped down. She moved slowly, deliberately, like a queen greeting a kingdom already hers. Her sandals touched Israeli soil with a sharp, confident tap. Her gown of purple and gold unfurled behind her like a banner of foreign dominion. Bracelets chimed softly with every step, announcing her presence long before her voice ever needed to. She looked up at Samaria, its stone buildings, its simpler architecture, its less ornate palace compared to Sidon's. There were no towering idols, no incense altars, no shrines carved with serpents and suns. The air smelled of livestock, earth, and cooking fires, not the rich spice and ritual incense she was accustomed to. Jezebel's eyes narrowed. Her lips curled slightly, not in fear, but in contempt. "This," she murmured under her breath, "is the land my husband rules." Ahab, riding beside her, smiled with pride. "It may not be Sidon, but it is strong, loyal, blessed by the God of Israel." Jezebel turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she whispered soft, cold, certain, "This land will bow to my gods." The words struck the air like a blade. Nearby servants froze. A palace steward's jaw tightened. Elders standing at the palace gate exchanged dark, uneasy glances. Even the wind seemed to pause as if listening to something forbidden. Among the crowd, a group of prophets of the Lord stood watching men in simple garments with stern expressions. Their leader, an older man with a weathered face, whispered, "She carries the presence of Baal. Trouble walks with her." Another prophet whispered back, "Ahab has brought fire into our midst." As Jezebel ascended the palace steps, her chin lifted higher. She scanned the courtyard, men bowing, women peeking nervously, guards uncertain how close to stand. Every movement radiated dominance. She saw no altars to Baal, no shrines for Asherah, no incense burning in her honor. That would change. Her eyes glittered with dangerous ambition. Behind her, Ahab watched her with admiration. Behind him, his advisers watched with dread. For they all knew, though Ahab did not, the moment Jezebel stepped into Samaria, a storm crossed the threshold with her. A storm that would swallow prophets, traditions, kings, and kingdoms. And somewhere in the hills beyond the city, a man of God, a prophet who walked with fire, felt an uneasy stirring in his spirit. Jezebel had arrived. Israel would never be the same. The transformation did not happen overnight, but it happened swiftly, so swiftly that many did not realize Israel was changing until the foundations of their faith had already begun to crack. Ahab was not a foolish man, but he was a soft-hearted king, easily swayed by emotion, admiration, and the desire for approval. Jezebel understood this within days of her arrival. She watched him carefully, how he listened, how he hesitated, how he longed for greatness, but feared the steps required to grasp it. And so she began to whisper. She whispered to him in the early mornings, as they reviewed matters of state. She whispered at night, as they walked through the palace gardens. She whispered during feasts, reclining beside him, her voice low and hypnotic, her words sliding into his thoughts like silk. "A king must not only lead," she murmured, "but command. Power is not inherited, it is taken. Fear my king, his loyalty's strongest root." Ahab listened, and slowly he began to believe. He admired her intelligence, her decisiveness, the way she spoke of nations and gods and diplomacy with the confidence of someone carved for rulership. Before long, her opinions became his policies. Once she secured Ahab's ear, Jezebel made her next move. She persuaded him that Israel needed unity, religious unity, under gods who brought fertility, rain, and prosperity. She spoke of Baal as the god of storm and harvest, the giver of life. She painted Asherah as the mother goddess who blessed kingdoms with abundance. And Ahab, eager to strengthen his alliance with Sidon and please his queen, agreed. The first altar went up on a hill overlooking Samaria, a towering structure of carved stone, decorated with bronze serpent designs and Sidonian symbols. Smoke from its offerings coiled into the sky like a challenge, but Jezebel was not satisfied. She ordered more. Soon temples rose across Israel dripping with gold, decorated with pillars engraved with flames and stars. Sidonian artisans arrived in caravans to build and beautify them. Jezebel herself oversaw the designs, insisting on grandeur that rivaled even the temples of Sidon. Where once stood humble altars to the God of Abraham, now rose gleaming monuments to Baal. Israelites watched in silence, some in awe, others in horror. Once the temples were complete, the true shift began. From the palace balcony, Jezebel issued her order. All Israel will worship Baal. All Israel will honor Asherah. There was no softness in her voice, no room for negotiation, no hint of the faith of Abraham. The decree spread through the land like wildfire. Priests of Baal danced through the streets, celebrating. Citizens bowed out of fear. Families argued in hushed whispers behind closed doors. But the worst came next. Remove the altars of the God of Israel. With Ahab's seal and Jezebel's command, soldiers tore down sacred places, smashed memorial stones, and burned remnants of the old worship. Prophets of the Lord fled into caves, hiding from Jezebel's growing rage against Israel's ancient faith. The kingdom trembled. What had begun as whispers in Ahab's ear had become the loudest force in Israel. And Jezebel, standing in her palace adorned in purple and gold, smiled as she watched the smoke of the new altars rise. To her, this was only the beginning. The hunt for prophets didn't begin with thunder or trumpets, no. Jezebel preferred something quieter, something that crept through Israel like smoke slipping under a locked door. It started with lists. Late at night, by lamplight dripping with scented oil, Jezebel sat on her carved Sidonian throne, golden lions on each armrest, obsidian inlaid along the back, while servants delivered scrolls containing the names of prophets, priests, and anyone rumored to still call on the God of Abraham. She read each name slowly, her fingers tapping the parchment with a rhythm that sounded almost like excitement. "These ones hide in the hills," a trembling advisor said. She smiled. "Good, we will smoke them out." As the days passed, the quiet hunt grew bolder. Her soldiers swept through towns, markets, homes. They tore down wooden altars, searching for men who prayed in secret. Mothers hid their sons behind false walls. Fathers disguised themselves as merchants. But Jezebel's influence was a shadow that stretched too far. Everywhere her spies lurked, eager to please their queen, who rewarded loyalty with gold and punished failure with fire. Then came the day of her first major villain moment. The moment Israel truly understood who had taken the throne of their hearts. It was morning, but the sky looked bruised with gray. In the palace courtyard, a group of captured priests, tired, dusty, frightened, were shoved forward by guards in bronze armor. Their white linen robes were torn, stained with dirt. Some limped. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Yet their eyes still held defiance. That alone seemed to annoy Jezebel. She stepped out onto the palace balcony first, her presence unmistakable. Draped in a deep crimson Sidonian gown, jewels glittering at her wrists, hair braided with gold rings that shined as she walked. The crowd fell into an uneasy silence. She descended the steps slowly, each step measured like a queen savoring her victory. When she reached the courtyard floor, she stopped only a few feet from the kneeling priests. One of the men lifted his head. Despite the blood on his face, he spoke, voice trembling but unwavering. "We will not bow to Baal." Jezebel paused, not shocked, not angered, almost Amused, she crouched down, bringing her face level with his. "You pray to a God who refuses to speak." "I serve gods who answer." Her eyes glinted dangerously. "Who is the fool, priest?" She straightened, turning her back to them as if they were nothing more than livestock awaiting slaughter. The guards exchanged nervous glances, unsure if she was done or merely beginning. Then she stopped mid-stride. Slowly she looked over her shoulder at the captain. Her eyelashes didn't flutter. Her expression didn't shift. Her voice came out soft, but it sliced through the courtyard like a blade dipped in ice. "Burn them. All of them." The words hung in the air, heavy and merciless. The priests gasped. Some cried out. Others closed their eyes and whispered final prayers. But Jezebel didn't blink. Not once. She didn't turn away as the guards dragged the captives toward the pyres already stacked with wood. She didn't flinch when the first flames roared to life. She didn't lower her gaze, even when the smoke began to twist into the sky like dark hands reaching upward. If anything, she appeared pleased. Pleased that her authority was finally unquestionable. Pleased that Israel now knew she would show no mercy. From the balcony above, Ahab watched in silence, troubled but powerless beneath the weight of Jezebel's conviction. And as the screens rose, Jezebel simply clasped her hands behind her back and whispered to herself, "Let Israel learn." It was the day the kingdom understood that Jezebel was not merely a foreign queen. She was a storm, and the fire she lit would burn across the land for years. The air in Samaria had grown heavy, almost metallic. Farmers cursed the sky as their fields cracked under the relentless sun. Children cried in empty streets, their small hands reaching for food that did not exist. Rivers shrank into muddy trickles, and the animals grew thin, their ribs sharp under their skin. A dreadful silence hung over the land, the silence of hunger, fear, and divine absence. It was in this chaos that Elijah appeared. He came not with armies, not with the pomp of royalty, but with the fire of God burning in his eyes. His robes were simple, his sandals coated with dust from the long journey, his hair wild and windswept. And yet, when he arrived at Ahab's palace gates, the mere sight of him made the guards hesitate. There was authority in his gait, a weight that was heavier than kings and soldiers combined. Ahab, desperate and scared, met him in the throne room. The king's voice trembled. "Are you the one who calls famine upon Israel?" Elijah's eyes blazed. "I am the servant of the Lord. The land will know hunger until you, your house, and this people turn away from their idolatry and worship the God who made heaven and earth." The words were like a knife, and they cut deeply into the royal court. Courtiers exchanged anxious glances. Ahab swallowed hard, sensing a power he could not bend with silver or influence. But it was Jezebel who reacted with true fury. She had watched from the shadowed balcony as Elijah's proclamation shook the king. Her lips curled with contempt. How dare a prophet of Israel, of that God she sought to replace, stand in her kingdom and claim authority? The thought ignited something dark within her, a need not only to defend her faith and power, but to destroy anyone who dared challenge her. And so the hunt began. For 3 years, Israel withered under drought. Crops failed, wells dried. Livestock perished. Children cried from hunger. Mothers clutched their bellies in despair. And everywhere Jezebel saw only one person to blame, Elijah, the wandering prophet who dared speak in her kingdom as though she were nothing. From her palace she issued orders to track him down, sending spies through forests, hills, and hidden caves. Every village was questioned, every traveler interrogated. She offered gold, land, and power to anyone who would betray him, and threatened death to those who resisted. And all the while, she watched Israel suffer, caring not for the children or the farmers, only for the man she could not touch with sword or decree. Elijah moved like a shadow, surviving on God's provision, hiding in ravines, fed by ravens, drinking from trickling streams, but he could feel her gaze, sharp as a spear, following him across the land. Every burnt field, every empty granary, every village mother weeping over her children's hunger, fueled Jezebel's hatred and his resolve. Finally, the tension reached a breaking point. Ahab could no longer endure the humiliation and despair. He summoned Elijah to Mount Carmel, the rugged plateau where heaven met earth in fiery cliffs and wild winds. Here the challenge would come, a confrontation between the God of Israel and the false gods Jezebel adored, between prophecy and pride, between fire and smoke. Elijah ascended the mountaintop, wind whipping his hair, sun scorching his shoulders, his heart steady. Below, Jezebel waited, though unseen. Her fury was palpable. Her spies whispered of the prophet's movements. Her priests of Baal and Asherah gathered in trembling anticipation. 3 years of drought, suffering, and fear had brought them here. The stage was set, and as Elijah raised his eyes to the sky, the wind seemed to pause, the clouds themselves holding their breath. Samaria had become a kingdom divided by famine, by fear, and by the unstoppable force of a queen who would not yield. In that tense stillness, the story teetered on the edge of divine confrontation, the air thick with the scent of incense, dust, and inevitable fire. It was here, on Mount Carmel, that Israel would learn the true cost of Jezebel as ambition and the power of a prophet who dared defy a queen. The air on Mount Carmel was electric, charged with anticipation. Farmers, villagers, and soldiers had gathered at the base and along the ridges, craning their necks to see the unfolding spectacle. The sky was a pale gray, heavy with tension, as if the clouds themselves were waiting for a verdict. On one side of the plateau stood 850 prophets of Baal, their robes fluttering in the wind, their chants rising in unison. They stomped and danced, crying out to their God, their voices blending into a deafening roar that echoed across the mountains. Tambourines clanged, drums pounded, hands were cut, blood smeared over their faces and chests as they begged their God to answer. Far below, in Samaria, Jezebel watched from her palace balcony. Draped in crimson silk, jewels catching the sunlight, her dark eyes glimmered with confidence. She smiled, confident that the God of Israel, invisible and silent, could never compete with this spectacle of her gods. In her mind, the challenge had already been won. But atop the mountain, Elijah stood alone, lean and dusty, his rough cloak flapping in the wind. He looked at the assembly of prophets and laughed, not a cruel laugh, but a mocking, sharp sound that cut through the cacophony. "Cry louder," he called out, his voice carrying across the mountaintop. "Shout. Maybe your God is sleeping. Maybe he is busy. Perhaps he is traveling. Or maybe he is on a journey, and you will never wake him." The prophets screamed louder, stomping with desperation, blood dripping from their wounds as they slashed themselves. Hours passed. Sweat ran down their faces. The sun rose higher, and still nothing happened. The ground seemed indifferent. The sky remained silent, and slowly a sense of hopelessness began to creep into the crowd. Elijah stepped forward, calm, silent, not a drum, not a chant, not a cry from him. He knelt, dirt under his knees, hands folded. He rebuilt the altar of the Lord, using 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. A trench hewed around the altar to hold water. He placed the offering, wood, bowl, and everything soaked in water, until the ground squelched beneath it. The crowd murmured, unsure. Some scoffed. Some whispered prayers. Some looked nervously toward the palace, imagining Jezebel's wrath when the prophet failed. Then Elijah raised his voice in a simple, unwavering command. "Lord, show these people that you are God. Let them see that I am your servant, and that your words are true." He stretched out his hands toward the sky. The gray clouds above trembled. The wind stilled. And then fire fell from heaven. It was not a flicker, not a spark. It was a roaring, blinding flame descending from the clouds like a spear of divine wrath. The altar, the wood, the soaked offering, even the stones themselves ignited instantly. The flames leapt higher, devouring the sacrifice, licking the ground, and spilling into the trench. Smoke spiraled into the sky, black and dense, a stark contrast to the clear day. The people screamed, not in fear of men, but in we of God. They fell to their knees, faces pressed to the ground, hearts pounding. And then, in the panic and chaos, the moment of judgment came for the false prophets. Ahab's soldiers, already present to maintain order, seized the 850 prophets of Baal. No chant, no plea, no bloodletting could save them. They were slaughtered on the mountain before the eyes of the crowd, a brutal, absolute end. From her palace, Jezebel's smile vanished. The confidence that had wrapped her like a cloak was gone. Her dark eyes widened. Her hands clenched the balcony railing. The display had shattered everything she believed. Her gods were powerless, her schemes were exposed, and the God of Israel had proven his authority in flames that could not be ignored. Elijah stood alone amidst the smoking altar, unscathed, unshaken, and alive. His voice echoed across the mountain. "Turn your hearts back to the Lord. Stop wandering after false gods. This is his land, his power, his people. The drought, the famine, the fear, all of it pointed toward one undeniable truth. Elijah was not just a man. He was a servant of God, and Jezebel's reign of terror was under threat. Below the mount, Israel began to kneel, whispers spreading like wildfire. "The Lord is God, the Lord is God." And somewhere far away in Samaria, Jezebel seethed. Her fury was no longer calm. Her confidence had been shaken. Her hatred had been ignited. And in the palace shadows, she began plotting the hunt that would consume Elijah next, vowing that the woman who commanded nations would never bow to a God she could not see. Mount Carmel had not just proven a point, it had set the stage for a clash of wills, a battle of fire and fear that would echo through the land for years to come. The moment the fire from heaven devoured the altar, the soaked wood, the stones, and the offering, a shiver ran through Samaria. The people cried out in awe. The false prophets lay defeated. The sky seemed to tremble, as though the heavens themselves had spoken. Far away, in the safety of her palace, Jezebel watched from the balcony. At first, she did not move. The sunlight glinted off her jewelry, the gold and ruby ornaments that had always made her seem untouchable. She looked down at the tiny figures, Ahab, the people, the defeated prophets, and for the briefest moment, she hesitated. Then the fire on the mountain struck something deeper than fear. It ignited fury. Her lips twisted, her fingers, gloved in golden cuffs, clenched so hard that her nails gouged the polished marble railing. She turned toward the nearest table, her eyes blazing like coals. With a sudden, violent motion, she slammed her hand onto the crystal goblet she had been holding. The glass shattered, spraying shards across the floor like splintered stars. Servants flinched, stepping back as she whirled, a figure of controlled yet terrifying rage. Her voice, usually smooth and intoxicating, rose into a scream that echoed through the palace halls. "No, this cannot be." The words were not only loud, they were a declaration of war. Every syllable dripped with venom, with the sheer force of a woman who had never been denied anything in her life. She could not fathom a God that would defy her, a man who could defy her, a kingdom that would defy her. She turned to her attendants, her guards, anyone within the radius of her fury. "Did you see it? Did you see the fire? The stones? The altar?" Her voice shook with rage, but there was no hesitation in her next words, only absolute, unyielding resolve. That man, Elijah, he will pay. He will die by tomorrow." A hush fell over the room. Servants and nobles exchanged uneasy glances. Jezebel rarely promised anything lightly. When she spoke of vengeance, it was as if the words themselves carried poison, ready to strike. She stomped across the chamber, her crimson gown trailing behind her like a blood-stain, eyes wild and unrelenting. Gold bracelets jingled violently with each step, sounding almost like chains being dragged across stone. She slammed her fist onto the table again, sending another crystal vase crashing to the ground. The noise was deafening, the shards cutting through the marble, but she did not notice. She did not care. Nothing mattered except the prophet, who had dared humiliate her and her gods. Her fury transformed into a plan cold, meticulous, and merciless. She would not wait for destiny to punish him. She would hunt him, corner him, and strike with precision. Her spies would search every cave, every wilderness, every hidden path in Israel. No place would be safe. No ally would be untouchable. Elijah would be found, and his life would end at her command. For hours she raged, pacing the palace corridors, her mind spinning with strategies of death and revenge. The court trembled under her presence. The walls themselves seemed to absorb her fury. Even Ahab, who had been awed by her beauty and intellect, felt the cold shadow of her wrath. He had been the king, but in that moment he was merely an observer of Jezebel's unstoppable rage. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, pacing the balcony, staring at the mountain where Elijah had stood. "Tomorrow he dies. I will see it with my own eyes." The night descended over Samaria, but Jezebel's rage burned brighter than any fire on Mount Carmel. And somewhere in the shadows of the kingdom, the prophet's name carried the weight of a queen's deadly promise. The sun had barely risen over Jezreel, painting the hills in gold and amber, when King Ahab rode toward the vineyard that had captured his desire. From afar, the small plot of land looked like a jewel set in the harsh, sun-scorched, earth-fertile soil. Grapevines heavy with promise, a stone wall sturdy enough to mark boundaries and keep out trespassers. In Ahab's mind, the vineyard would be a personal retreat, a quiet sanctuary where he could wander among the vines, inspecting the grapes as the sun set and the wind stirred the leaves. But Naboth, the rightful owner, stood firmly at the edge of his vineyard, hands resting on the weathered fence, eyes steady and unwavering. "The vineyard belongs to my ancestors," he said simply. "I will not sell it. It is not for sale, not for silver, not for gold." Ahab's brow furrowed. He tried to reason with him, to flatter him, to offer wealth beyond imagination. He promised favors, lands, gifts beyond counting, but Naboth would not yield. Frustration burned in Ahab's chest like a bitter poison. By evening he returned to the palace, riding slowly, shoulders slumped, head bowed, his royal robes trailing like a banner of disappointment. Courtiers watched in silence, unsure whether to mourn or hide from the king's sour mood. Ahab, the mighty king of Israel, appeared for all the world as a child denied a toy. It was then that Jezebel entered the scene, as always perceptive, deliberate, and utterly in control. She found Ahab pacing in his private chamber, muttering under his breath, kicking at the rugs in frustration. Silks swirled around her as she approached, her presence magnetic, her confidence absolute. Without a word, she reached out and stroked his hair, a gesture that was tender only in appearance, concealing calculation beneath the warmth of her touch. "Do you not understand?" she whispered, leaning close, her breath brushing his ear. "You are a king. Let me handle it." Ahab looked at her, frustrated but helplessly drawn to her power. Jezebel's dark eyes glinted with cunning, her mind already spinning the web that would ensnare Naboth. He nodded, half in relief, half in awe, unaware that his desire was about to become a blood-soaked scheme. Jezebel returned to her chambers and picked up her quill. With precise, deliberate strokes, she wrote letters in Ahab's seal, addressed to the nobles and elders of Jezreel and surrounding towns. Each letter was a masterpiece of deceit. Naboth accused of blasphemy, conspiracy against the king, and treasonous acts he had never committed. The instructions were clear: arrest him, judge him swiftly, and carry out the penalty without mercy. The orders went out like wildfire. Soldiers, eager to please the queen or fearfully complying with her authority, descended upon Naboth. They dragged him from his home, from the vineyard he had cherished and tended for generations. The townspeople whispered in horror as the stones of the vineyard, the grapevines, and the wooden fence witnessed the injustice. Naboth was stoned to death, his cries swallowed by the dry wind of Jezreel. When the news reached Ahab, he could barely contain his satisfaction. He rode back to the vineyard, tracing the stones with his fingers, inhaling the scent of crushed earth and vines. Cold as it was, a triumphant smile spread across his face. The vineyard, his desire, was finally his. Victory, though drenched in blood, filled his chest. But triumph always comes with shadows. Not long after, Elijah appeared, his presence sudden and undeniable. He did not bow. He did not whisper. He strode into the hall of Ahab's palace, as if the walls themselves were made of air, carrying with him the weight of divine authority. His eyes blazed, scanning the room until they locked on Jezebel, the queen who had orchestrated murder in her husband's name. "Elijah has come," whispered the courtiers, fear and awe mingling in their voices. "He speaks the words of God." Elijah's voice rang out, steady and unflinching. "Ahab, you have sold yourself to wickedness. You have murdered and seized what is not yours. And you, Jezebel, you who plotted in secret, who stained this land with innocent blood, know this: dogs shall lick your blood, and the house of Ahab shall fall." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Silence fell. The court froze, the air heavy with dread. Then the camera or the observer's eye would focus on Jezebel. Her face, a mask of calm for a heartbeat, betrayed nothing. And then, slowly, her eyes narrowed, dark and sharp, burning with fury and ambition. The fire in them was unmistakable. She would not forget. She would not forgive. She would not allow prophecy or fear to control her destiny. In that chilling moment, the kingdom understood that Jezebel was not merely a queen of wealth and beauty. She was of calculated cruelty and unyielding ambition. A storm gathering over Israel. The vineyard lay silent. Naboth's voice had been silenced forever, but the echo of prophecy and vengeance lingered, and in the narrowing eyes of Jezebel, one could see that the storm had only just begun. After years of Jezebel's reign of terror, her cruelty, her lies, her manipulation of kings, her relentless pursuit of prophets, the kingdom of Israel was trembling under the weight of fear. Families whispered in the streets. Farmers prayed in secret. Even the palace guards, once loyal, now feared the queen's dark temper more than the God of Israel. But God's plan was moving quietly, far beyond the walls of Samaria. In a quiet village far from the palace, a prophet of the Lord appeared to a man named Jehu, a commander in Israel's army. The prophet, speaking with the authority of God, anointed him king over Israel, anointing him not just to lead, but to execute judgment on the house of Ahab and on Jezebel herself. "Rise," the prophet said, "for the Lord has chosen you. You will strike down the bloodline of Ahab and the queen who rules wickedly. The kingdom will tremble, and vengeance will come through your hand." Jehu accepted the call, his heart steady, his purpose clear. He mounted his horse, a stallion as black as midnight, and rode out with a small band of loyal soldiers. But soon his force would grow, like a storm gathering strength across the plains. The earth itself seemed to shiver under the pounding hooves. Meanwhile, in the palace of Samaria, Jezebel went about her day with the same air of command she always carried. She moved through the grand halls, her robes of purple and gold trailing behind her. Courtiers bowed, servants whispered, and guards moved quickly to obey her every command. She was the queen, untouchable, or so she believed. But the first whisper of danger came like a shadow creeping across the walls. A young servant, pale and trembling, approached her. "Your Majesty, soldiers are on the road. They ride fast, they carry banners. They say, 'He's coming.'" Jezebel's lips tightened. Her eyes, always sharp and calculating, narrowed. She stepped to the balcony and looked toward the horizon. Dust rose in the distance, moving like a dark wave, the clatter of hooves growing louder with every heartbeat. Her heart raced not with fear, but with fury. No one had dared approach her palace uninvited. No one had challenged her rule so directly. She turned sharply, the sound of her bracelets jingling like warning bells, and summoned her generals. "Prepare the city, gather the guards, arm the walls. Whoever enters my palace without my permission dies." Her voice carried like steel, cutting through the panic of the room. Servants hurried through the corridors, whispering to one another, "He's coming for her. Jehu, the army of the Lord." Fast as lightning, the ground shook beneath the advancing army. Jehu rode like a storm, the wind whipping his cloak, dust swirling around him. His men shouted war cries, the sound carrying across the valleys. Horses neighed, iron clanged, and the air itself seemed alive with the approaching judgment. Inside the palace, Jezebel moved quickly, her mind racing. She called her advisors, plotting, scheming, trying to find a way to strike before the storm arrived. "Send messengers, gather loyal soldiers. Do not let this man touch me," she commanded. But even as she spoke, the pounding of hooves grew louder, closer. The city walls trembled with the noise. Windows rattled. The people outside whispered in terror, watching the distant line of riders grow ever larger. Jezebel's calm mask began to crack, replaced by the fire of pure rage and desperation. Her eyes, dark and dangerous, flared as she realized the prophecy had reached her door. The palace that had once seemed untouchable now felt small, vulnerable, and exposed. The first scouts of Jehu's army appeared at the gates. A wave of dread swept through the palace. Servants gasped. Generals stiffened. The queen's confidence had never been tested like this. She lifted her chin high, smoothing her hair and adjusting her robes, as if to show the army that she would not bow even in the face of inevitable judgment. But her mind raced. Plans, traps, lies, and blood all would be needed to survive the storm Jehu had become. From the streets, the distant sound of marching grew louder. Dust clouds turned the sun red, and the whispers of the people spread like wildfire. "He's coming. He's coming for her." Jezebel, for all her cunning, all her power, could sense the tide turning. The queen who had manipulated kings, crushed prophets, and spilled innocent blood now faced a force she could not control. And as Jehu's army drew closer, the palace trembled, not from wind, not from fear of soldiers, but from the certainty that divine justice had arrived at the doorstep of Jezebel, the queen, who had ruled through fire, blood, and terror. The stage was set. The storm had reached Samaria, and Jezebel, fierce, proud, and terrifying, would face the consequences of a life built on wickedness. The sun had begun its slow descent over Samaria, painting the palace walls in streaks of crimson and gold. The city was tense, hushed, as if it could sense the approaching storm. Inside the grand palace, Jezebel moved through her private chambers with a composure that masked the tightening coil of fear inside her. She had faced kings, armies, prophets, and priests, yet now, for the first time, she felt the unmistakable weight of inevitability pressing down upon her. She entered her boudoir, the room dimly lit by flickering oil lamps. The heavy silks of her gowns hung from hooks along the walls. Jewels sparkled faintly in the candlelight. Mirrors lined the room, reflecting her image from every angle. A queen, proud, beautiful, and finally aware that even queens cannot escape death. Jezebel approached one of the larger mirrors, her dark eyes meeting her own reflection. She did not flinch. She did not tremble. Her fingers, delicate yet firm, began their ritual. First, she painted her eyes with kohl, the black lines sharp, bold, and commanding. Then she traced her lips with deep crimson, ensuring her face was the perfect mask of royalty. She lifted her hair, braiding it with care, threading it with golden pins and jewels that caught the flickering lamplight. Every movement was precise, practiced, as though the performance of her own death required elegance, defiance, and dignity. She spoke softly to herself, a haunting monologue that echoed off the marble walls. If I must die, if the world will see my end, then I will die as a queen. Let them remember Jezebel, not as a woman brought low, but as a queen who commanded her kingdom until the very last breath. A silence followed her words, deep and heavy, as though the room itself held its breath. Outside in the palace courtyard, the sound of hooves thundered closer and closer. The air was tense, electric, as Jehu's army approached. The queen could hear it, the shouting of soldiers, the clanking of armor, the distant cries of the city caught in anticipation. Then a voice, cold and commanding, called through the palace gates, "Who is on my side? Who will stand with Jehu?" Jezebel did not flinch at the sound of her name, whispered among the enemy ranks. Instead, she stepped toward the balcony overlooking the courtyard, her heart steady, her eyes glinting like dark jewels. Her reflection in the window showed a woman unbound, regal, and prepared to face the storm that had come for her. The eunuchs, the servants who had once obeyed her every whim, now became instruments of fate. They appeared behind her, silent, obedient to the commands that Jehu had set. Jezebel turned her gaze toward them, sharp and fierce, as if daring them to act. In a sudden, swift motion, they seized her. She struggled, her silk gown rippling, her jeweled hair catching the dying light. But her strength could not resist the inevitability of her fate. With a final cry that was more defiance than fear, she was thrown from the balcony, her fall echoing across the courtyard below. The courtyard was silent for a heartbeat. Then the prophecy was fulfilled. The dogs of the city, scavenging and watchful, descended upon her body. They tore, and the palace that had once resounded with her laughter and commands now resonated with the grim truth of divine justice. Her blood mingled with the stones beneath her, the scent sharp and tragic in the evening air. Inside the palace was quiet. The music which had accompanied her life in power and luxury died into silence. The tapestries hung motionless. The flickering candle flames cast long shadows across empty halls. Jezebel, who had once ruled with gold, cunning, and cruelty, was no more. Yet even in death, the memory of her ambition lingered. The city whispered of the queen who had dared challenge the prophets, manipulate kings, and wield power with unmatched cunning. She had been beautiful, brilliant, ruthless, and in her final moments, she had claimed the dignity of a queen, even as her life was violently taken. And so the story of Jezebel ended bloodied, silenced, but unforgettable. Her fall was violent, tragic, and inevitable, a final chapter in a life defined by ambition, power, and defiance against forces far greater than herself. The echoes of her story would haunt Samaria for generations, a cautionary tale of pride, cruelty, and the ultimate price of a throne built on sin.